Welcome to Trust Talk. Today on our show, we're joined by Professor Sim Sitkin from Duke University, a renowned expert in leadership. He's going to dive into how trust and distrust work, with trust changing gradually, but distrust being more like a deep-rooted, tough-to-shake belief. He'll share insights from his study on a Dutch court, where differences in values between administrators and judges led to trust issues, and how they worked to fix that. We'll also hear his thoughts on why qualities like competence, benevolence, and integrity are crucial for building trust, and how companies like IDEO use control systems to actually boost trust. Sim sheds light on the importance of ethical leadership and how both immediate actions and broader systemic changes can influence trust. Plus, he'll discuss the role of a leader's relationship with their team in building trust. And don't miss his thoughts on the future of trust research, where he's developing a field theory that connects the dots between distrust and general trust. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Sim, it's quite a pleasure to have you as our guest on the Trust Talk podcast. With your extensive research background, we believe you are the ideal person to kick off our discussion with the following question. Are trust and distrust essentially two sides of the same coin?
The answer is yes and no. Trust and distrust do exist on a continuum. However, the way I like to think of it is think of trust as a smooth curve where you can build up incrementally or go down incrementally. Distrust is qualitatively different. Distrust involves a pervasive perception. So in other words, it's not the same as low trust. I can have low trust in you in one domain and high trust in another domain. With distrust, I have now written you off. I no longer will consider what you say or what your intentions are. If you do something positive, I'll probably think, oh, he must have an ulterior motive for that. He's trying to trick me. So when you're in the distrust domain, whoever or whatever institution you're distrusting is completely negative, and it's very hard to get out of that. So if you think of trust and distrust, trust goes from low to high in kind of a smooth curve. Distrust is like a basin at the bottom of that curve. Once you're in that basin, it's very hard to get out of it. So in that sense, it's qualitatively different from low trust, but it is at the bottom of this continuum.
Can you explain how people's shared values and worldviews affect trust or distrust, given that trust and distrust are, like you said, quite different and have distinct factors?
Yes. So one of the triggers of distrust is if I believe that we have what we refer to as value incongruence. If your worldview is fundamentally different from mine, if your values are different from mine in a fundamental way, I may just say, he's looking at the world a different way than I am, and it doesn't matter what the details are. Values are relevant to trust, but it's not as discrepant. So congruent values definitely help trust, but we can have moderate agreement on our values, and that might reduce my trust a little bit. But when they're fundamental, important, and incongruent, now you're in the distrust domain.
Are competence, benevolence, and integrity equally important when it comes to building trust? And can you share some real-life examples where these qualities make a big difference?
Yes. So most of the literature on trust would say they are all three relatively equally important. I don't agree with that. That's not what we found in some of our work. We found things like competence are important once you've established certain kinds of relational connections with the person. That's where benevolence comes in. So I would argue that for trust, benevolence is essential. Competence is helpful. And the example I like to use is imagine you have a political rival or even an enemy. Will you trust them more because they're more competent, even though there is not a shred of benevolence between you? You first want to know that someone actually cares about your welfare. Then you're going to be more open to them. Once you know they care about your welfare, then you do want them to be competent. That's going to matter because I'm not going to rely on you the same way if you're not competent. But benevolence can make higher competence a negative factor rather than a positive factor.
You just mentioned value incongruence. You did research with Antoinette Weibel and Katinka Bijlsma-Frankema on value incongruence perceptions as a factor in distrust. From what I understand, this refers to a situation when individuals or groups perceive significant differences in core values with another party, leading to potential distrust. Can you elaborate on what your findings were in that single case study, which I believe involved a Dutch court?
Yes, that's correct. What we were looking at was why was there a fracture between the administrators and the legal side in the court. It really was a very distrustful kind of relationship. And it was because the administrators were focused on efficiency in operations, and the judicial side was focused on the practice of law. And if it was inefficient, so be it, because our focus is on coming to the correct judgment and so forth. And they saw each other. And by the way, I am sure your listeners have encountered this, whether they're on the administrative side or on, like in a university, you could be on the science side. In a company, it could be the administrators trying to enforce the rules and procedures and other people who are trying to make great products or connect with customers. There's an incongruence between what's being prioritized and sometimes even what the fundamental values are that are being pursued. And so what happened in that court was there was a complete breakdown of communication between the parties. And by looking at the factors you can use to ameliorate distrust and begin to build trust, and they're not exactly the same thing. You mentioned competence, benevolence, and integrity. That's the way you build trust. That's not really how you address distrust issues. You've first got to build the bridges showing we have some shared values, we have some shared ways of looking at the world, so the differences are not a deal breaker. Once you've built those bridges, and the way you do that is by increasing the amount of interaction. If you look at a lot of the polarization in the world today, people look at what's different between the parties and they don't realize they may have vast overlap in what's similar between the parties. So they could use that to build bridges, to recognize they do have some shared values. They do have some common practices that they want to uphold, but they're not focusing on that. They're focusing on these fundamental differences, which may turn out not to be so fundamental upon greater examination. And that's what we found in the court of law, that once they started doing that, they were able to build the bridges and reconnect, interact with each other more. And as a result, they could start building trust.
I want to talk about trust and the role of control in organizations. How do formal and informal control mechanisms play into trust building within an organization? And can you provide examples of organizations that have successfully employed these controls to enhance trust?
Some of my early work challenged some of the received wisdom about how control related to trust. And now with my colleague Chris Long, we've been doing a lot of work since then, and some work with Katinka Bijlsma as well. The traditional way that sociologists looked at the relationship between control and trust was that as you build control mechanisms, you reduce trust, because if things work well, people will give credit to the system, not to the person. So it may build trust in the institution, but it decreases trust in the individuals. That was the traditional sociological point of view. I challenged that because there are many things that are just everyday annoyances and distractions. And by creating systems that are supportive of what we're trying to do, it actually makes my life easier, and it allows us to engage in interaction around, let's say we really do have a difference, but we've already established 70, 80, 90% of what we do is routinized. We agree, it fits with what our priorities are. we can work out the other 10 or 20%. So formal systems and informal control systems as well can eliminate a lot of points of conflict and friction that are not essential. They're not that important, but they can really lead to less and less trust between parties. And probably people have seen this in their own organizations where there may be two people who now, if you say yes, I immediately say no because we've got this history of antagonism. And if you say yes, I assume there's some ulterior motive, so I oppose it. This is what diplomats do, by the way. Start to build the common ground. You had Nick Wheeler on, and this is the kind of thing that Nick Wheeler looks at. If we can start to build that common ground, then we have the opportunity to really leverage the control systems, both formal and informal, to build stronger and stronger trust over time. Where, again, I hope many of your listeners have this. I know it's true for me. I have people where we really have strong disagreements, but we really trust each other because we have some ground rules we've established, and there's certain things we don't talk about, and we focus on the things that we share rather than the things that we really differ on. So I think part of the idea is to build on the old Max Weber notion of bureaucracy as a positive, not just a negative. Bureaucracy solves a lot of problems when it's done well. Similarly with culture, the informal controls of culture solve a lot of problems when they're done well and when they're well designed. But certainly there are cases we can all think of where they don't work well. One of my favorite examples of this is the product design company IDEO. It's considered one of the most creative, innovative companies in the world. They hire people who are these wild and crazy creative types. Yet when they solve problems, they also have a procedure where the phrase that was used is the self-appointed adults come in and say, okay, we've got to stop what we were doing. We're going to shift and we're going to do this instead. Now, why does that work? Why wouldn't the creative types just rebel and distrust the motives of the administrators? The answer is the administrators are also creative types. They know they share the values. Whenever they're not wearing that hat of being I'm the adult in the room, they're right in there being creative and wild and crazy. And the people there know the systems were put in place, whether they're formal controls or informal controls, and they have both. They're put in place to facilitate what we all think is most important, both in our process, in the way we do things, and what our goals are. So I think it's important to establish that basic understanding of who the other person is, what we're trying to do collectively. And when the systems are designed to control us, to help us stay on the right path that we all agree on, that enhances trust rather than undermining it.
In previous interviews, you've emphasized the importance of preparing future leaders with a focus on reflection, thoughtfulness, and ethics. Can you provide some practical and actionable guidelines for aspiring leaders who aim to enhance their ethical leadership skills?
Yeah, I'm not sure they're going to be quite as concrete as you'd like, but let me give it a try. I think one of the downsides of the rise of an economic way of thinking about things is that you can justify almost any decision today by turning to the financials, by turning to the numbers. What I think is missing and what we really, it's not that that's bad. We really want to have those data and be able to look at the objective factors. But I think what's missing is an emphasis on what are the core values we're trying to pursue? What are the things we consider out of bounds, considering our values and our ethical principles? And that as a leader, I not only model that, that's what's commonly emphasized, and I think that's important. But what's not emphasized enough is I need to also provide language for it. I need to be talking about it. I need to be sharing stories about it. So it is true that actions speak louder than words, but what I like to say for leaders is actions in the absence of words are frequently misunderstood. And leaders need to explain why they're doing what they're doing and why they're not doing other things. And they need to not only ground their own actions in values, but they need to encourage others to do that. So the language that is used in discussing options and what our priorities are includes value-driven choices, not just financially driven choices. And you can see, by the way, this circles back to some of the value incongruence issues in distrust and the building a sense of what are our shared values that are guiding what we do. And a lot of times people just assume it's so obvious that it doesn't have to be stated. And if it's so obvious, I would say, so why not state it? It's something we can be proud of. I think the root of leaders being more ethical is grounding their decisions and their articulation of the reasons for the decisions more explicitly in values. That doesn't make you weak-minded, it makes you strong-minded.
So do immediate factors like a leader's skills and behavior have a quick impact on trust, while more distant factors like organizational culture and reputation affect trust more slowly over time, in what you found in your research?
Well, actually, I don't have direct data on that. So my research hasn't spoken to that explicitly. I would say that I do think that systems have a more long-lasting, I'm not sure it's a slower, but it's a more long-lasting impact than individual leader actions. But I do think the consistency of leader actions and words over time, just like the consistency of the formal and informal systems that are put in place, are fundamental influences on whether trust occurs. And in both cases, by the way, one issue that I really want to make sure we stress here, and often is not addressed, is the importance of conveying understanding. That for leaders, actually for all of us trying to engender trust in others, the first thing that we need to really worry about is, am I conveying to them that I really understand them in their terms, not in my terms? So if I disagree with something you believe, I might say, oh, I understand you, but then I frame it in pejorative terms. That doesn't really reflect your perspective. If you look at polarization today, this is a good example. Both sides either implicitly or sometimes explicitly say, I really don't understand how the other side thinks. If you don't understand how another party thinks and approaches things and values things, there is no reason for them to trust you. Once you show that you do understand them, then you can begin to share positives and negatives and agreements and disagreements, but you've shown you really do understand how they see the world. And there is some research, not my research, that has found that if you first convey that you understand the other party in their terms, they are more open to hearing and considering your arguments where you disagree with them. And that's what we have found in our research, that understanding is the building block, that then other things like, now I care about you, so I'm benevolent, I respect you, I will treat you fairly. Those things build on a fundamental conveyance that I understand how you see the world. And I truly understand it through your eyes. Then when I talk about where we might disagree, I have some credibility to build on because you know I've truly connected with you.
Recent research on leadership behavior and trust has shown that certain factors like competence, we talked about that earlier, or an ability, don't directly create trust on their own. Instead, they influence trust indirectly through the way leaders interact with their followers. Is that what you just said?
I did say that, but let me add one twist to it because I think we can extend that one more step. In our research, what we have found is competence is related to trust, but it's related to trust through in only when it interacts with high levels of positive relational ties. So benevolence, understanding, respect, fairness. Competence alone doesn't create trust. It's only when it works in conjunction with relational ties. Similarly, designing control systems has an effect on trust, but it only works if partly what it's conveying is we've designed control systems that reflect what you're trying to accomplish, that reflect your worldview and values. And when that's the case, those systems really reinforce trust and stabilize it. In the absence of that, those systems are viewed as, or can be viewed as, a negative.
You published together with Marila Hernandez and Chris Long, you mentioned him earlier, your research results into relational leadership and trust. Can you explain why relational leadership behaviors are so crucial in fostering trust within leader-follower relationships? And related to that, what makes the mediation effect of relational leadership on personal and contextual leadership behavior so intriguing and essential for leaders to understand?
Okay, yeah, that's what I was just talking about, that if you think about the difference, so we have identified 3 different clusters. It's part of a larger set of clusters of behaviors that effective leaders engage in. And each of those clusters of behaviors we found to have a different effect on followers. So competence is one aspect of personal leadership behaviors. Do I convey to you that I know what I'm talking about? Relational leadership behaviors have to do with, what is my connection to you as my follower? And contextual leadership is me helping you understand the situation in which we're operating. So to the point I made earlier, if I am more competent and you view me as credible, if I am able to clarify the situation that we're operating in, those are positives, but only if you believe my connection to you is positive. If I care about your welfare, if I really understand what you need, then you're likely to trust me. If I'm more competent in terms of the personal leadership behaviors, or I'm better at making sense of the world for you in terms of contextual leadership behaviors, those are only a plus if I already have, it's mediated by the relational piece of it. A positive interpersonal connection mediates how other factors influence trust.
I can't remember in which article it was, but I think you wrote about what you said, a tipping point in the developing distrust, if I may come back to that. Can you explain how organizations or individuals can recognize this, what you call tipping point, and what strategies can be employed to prevent distrust from escalating once this threshold is reached?
We don't have really good, clear enough research on the details of the tipping point to give what I would consider reliable, practical advice. But let me explain a little bit about the idea behind it. So remember, I described trust and distrust, where trust is on a continuum. Think of a smooth slope. At the bottom of that slope, there's a basin. Well, there's a lip around that basin that you've got to get over to get into the distrust domain. Getting over that lip is the tipping point. The tipping point is now, maybe you made a mistake and I wondered, oh, is he really competent? You make another mistake and I say, well, maybe he's not really trying hard. You make another one and then another one, and all of a sudden it accumulates. And so the key is, where does it go from you made a mistake in calculating some math, you made a mistake in releasing a report that was premature. All of a sudden, it gets to a certain point where I say, these aren't individual isolated mistakes. He just either is not diligent or not competent or is trying to undermine what we're doing. So the tipping point, it occurs when one of 2 things happens. One is there is an accumulation of negative evidence that reaches a threshold. The second is when you violated something so fundamental that I now question your underlying ability, your underlying dedication, or your underlying values. Now, I do want to highlight one other thing, that I'm also currently doing some work on what's called generalized trust. It hasn't been connected in the research literature, but it's really the flip side of distrust. Generalized trust, I've now decided, not only do I have high trust in you, but I'm not going to question anything you do. I totally trust you. So if you do something terrible, it must have been someone else's fault. If you make a mistake, it's not your fault. Or maybe I revise it so it's no longer seen as a mistake. So just as distrust is a pervasive kind of phenomenon, generalized trust is as well. And there's another example where I'm working with Chris Long on this, and I'm also doing some work with Tony Kong and Audrey Korsgaard on this notion of generalized trust and how it relates to the others. And it's the same thing. You can think of true believers in a movement or a political movement or their belief in some leader of their cult. They've now moved into generalized trust. Well, again, there has to be this tipping point where they go over a threshold and then they're in the basin of generalized trust. And it's very hard to get them out of that basin. That's a dilemma. Political scientists will say, we really don't want a lot of generalized trust. We want people to be more thoughtful, that we want them to be more critical. You want them to have an orientation toward trust in our society's institutions and our leaders and so forth, but not blind trust.
Like Pipa Norris, yeah.
Yeah, and generalized trust is a form of blind trust where it's now, I'm no longer questioning anything. And as an effective leader, that's not what you want. You don't want people to distrust you, obviously. You don't want generalized trust either. What you want is people to be thoughtfully and critically high trusting.
You refer to your yet unpublished research with Chris Long and Audrey Korsgaard and Tony Kong. Did you there suggest we have the opportunity of developing a general field theory that incorporates current scientific silos?
That is our hope. Audrey and Tony and I are working on a more in-depth look at generalized trust. Chris and I are working on, I feel like it's a little audacious to call it a generalized field theory. You know, the work on distrust, the work on trust, and the work on generalized trust have really been somewhat isolated. And we're trying to develop this integrative approach to thinking about in what ways are they really different and in what ways are they similar. And then to get to your earlier question, what are the factors that push you into generalized trust or distrust? And what are the remedies that allow you to help people get out of those basins?
Sim, I always end my interviews with a question related to the future. So how do you see the landscape of trust evolving in the next, let's say, decade, especially with the rapid advancements in technology and global dynamics?
Well, I think the research on trust has been advancing quite rapidly over the past couple of decades. The volume of research on trust has just exploded. I think one of the reasons a more general theory is helpful is it helps the different subgroups relate to each other and draw on each other in a cumulative way. I think the big breakthrough going forward is in two areas. One is, and we've had this happen in our discussion today, there's several things where we just don't know enough about the specifics and how they work. And so I think the empirical work on trust is really going to advance our understanding of the nuances. The second thing is I don't think there is enough emphasis on the practical implications of our research. And in today's polarized societies and the kinds of conflict that's emerging, understanding how you unravel distrust and build stronger trust ties is going to be essential, not only to operating in business organizations and in government, but in our societies in a whole host of arenas. And you just look at the challenges that are starting to be surfaced about AI. How are people going to be able to trust any information they're getting? And one of the ways that we haven't addressed this is people are in news information bubbles because they need something they feel they can trust, even if it doesn't merit their trust. And so they're staying in a bubble because it keeps reinforcing what they want to believe. And so they feel they can trust it. And I think we need to find ways where people can be more open, more flexible, value having their beliefs challenged. And that requires enhanced trust in our institutions of society. I think that's one of the next big thresholds. Can we understand the erosion of trust in our institutions And can we provide guidance on how to rebuild that trust?
So it shows that there is still a lot to do, and also for us to talk to very different people to get a better understanding of the role of trust in our lives.
Yes.
Sim, thank you very much for being available. It was a pleasure talking with you.
It was my pleasure. I appreciate it.
I wish you good luck with your research and publications, and hopefully we meet in real time, maybe on one of the FINT conferences.
Yes, I would look forward to that. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Of course.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.